Yes, how are we all? I hope all is well. My name is Sachin, and this is the Total Cricket Podcast, episode 15. Today, I'm going to be doing the five things we learned from the ICC Women's World Cup 2017. So let's get right into it. It was a great tournament. England coming out as the champions in the end. And the number one thing we learned is that the women's game is evolving. Now, right off the bat, women's cricket and men's cricket are completely different. Let's not compare the two. Let's appreciate them in their own right. Because if you want to compare, you have to realize that the batsmen, they have more power. The fast bowlers, they bowl faster. And in the field, they're quicker across the turf, just more athletic in general. These are just facts that you just can't escape, which is why there is no point in comparing the two. So that's the first thing I think that we need to just get out of the way. Now, if we look at the women's game as its own entity, in its own right, you look at, I think the biggest complaint I feel people have about the women's game is the lack of power hitting. It's the lack of boundaries in general and batsmen not scoring at a particularly fast rate. Well, I think in this tournament, we saw that there is an ongoing improvement in this regard. Now, let's have a look at the last Women's World Cup. So that was in 2013. And let's have a look at some stats here. So this is an aggregate for the whole tournament. The strike rate of 65.79. There were 100 in terms of 100 scored. There were 1100 scored. There were 33 50s scored. There were 1066 fours scored and 67 sixes scored. Now, look at the difference. Look at the drastic improvement actually in all those categories to this World Cup in 2017. Now, in terms of the strike rate, that's gone up to 73.65. There were 1400 scored in this tournament, 56 50s, 1,272 fours, and 111 sixes. So you can see across all those statistics, there is an improvement. And in general, we've seen that the power hitting in the women's game has improved and the scores are getting bigger. So if we think about it, I think it's fair to say that we can expect this to continue to improve. And as long as the game is evolving, that's great. And I think that this World Cup showcased that evolution really nicely. You only have to look at some of the scores that were racked up in this tournament. England got to 370 twice in the tournament. 370 is a huge score. I don't think anyone can complain about a lack of runs there. 370. And in general, as I said, the strike rate has increased across the board. And this can only be a good thing for the women's game to add more excitement and to draw fans in to watch. And you also only have to look at the outrageous individual performances that we saw in this tournament. Chamriat Patu got 178 not out against Australia. That's the third highest score ever in women's ODIs. Harmanpreet Kaur, she got 171. Meg Lanning, 152. Tammy Beaumont, 148. Nat Sither got a pair of hundreds. Mithali Raj got 100. These were some sensational innings. Deandra Dottin, 104 of 76 balls. Sophie Devine, 93 of 41 balls. Alex Blackwell, 90 of 56. These are explosive innings. Explosive. And when you talk about power hitting, you think sixes. Let me reiterate the difference in the sixes hit from the last World Cup to this World Cup. A jump from 67 to 111. That is close to doubled. And it just shows the improvement in the power hitting in the women's game. No doubt the advent of 2020 and tournaments like the WBBL and the Kia Super League have certainly helped that. And I think it's great that we're seeing this evolution of the women's game. And don't forget the bowlers as well. There was some fantastic bowling performances, and we saw great skill in the bowling, I thought, too. You can't question the skill. Anya Shrubsole, the player of the match in the final, she got 6 wickets. Incredible to bowl England to victory. Her slower ball, those off cutters, the skill to bowl those were exceptional. We know she's a good in-swing bowler, is capable of bowling that in-swing Yorker. That's her bread and butter. The skill there is fantastic. We saw some other great performances as well. Gaikwad, Bish, Huddleston, and Sune Luz all getting fifers in this tournament. Dane van Niekerk got a 4 wicket haul on 3 separate occasions. And you talk about skill. I think the hardest discipline of bowling in cricket is leg spin. And we saw leg spin dominate, as we have seen men's and women's ODIs recently. And the skill that was shown by Sune Luz, Dane van Niekerk, she was the top wicket taker in the tournament. Amelia Kerr, she was fantastic. She took 10 wickets and she's only 16. Incredible from her. And really, these leg spinners are basically taking over the game. The leg spinner is such a big threat now, and to see these leg spinners in the women's game is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. The skill level certainly there. Also, don't forget the fast bowlers. Julan Goswami put in a fantastic performance in the final with 3 for 22, 3 for 23. There's other elite fast bowlers. Shabby Ismail, who bowls 120 kilometers an hour. She's the quickest bowler in women's cricket. She got 3 for 14. That is ridiculous. That was against Sri Lanka. There have been some terrific performances, and really, I feel that the skill level is fantastic in the bowling. Obviously, the fast bowlers, they don't bowl as quick as the men, but the skill level is unquestionable. And really, this goes into this evolution. It is continuous. The women's game, the funding has not been there as much as it has been in the men's. So naturally, the evolution is a little bit slower than the men's game, but it is there, and it's there for all to see. It's a great product, and as long as these players continue to get better, then it's fantastic for the game. Now, the second thing we learned from the tournament was that while I said the women's game is evolving, there are still some areas of improvement. Now, I look particularly at the final as a real case in point for this argument. Now, I talked in my preview for the final about who was going to be able to cope with the external factors the best, because whoever did that the best was going to win. And we saw that India were unable to cope with that, and England stole victory really in the end. Now, you look at the game, India were chasing a fairly paltry 229 for victory. And the crazy thing is they were 191 for 3. They were cruising. The run rate was well under a run a ball. So there was no need to play these big shots. You just had to milk it. And what we saw was a cataclysmic collapse from India to go from 191 for 3 to then bowled out for 218. That is a shocking collapse. That is losing your last 7 wickets for 27 runs. And what we saw here is that India panicked. This should have been an easy chase, but I think that in the women's game, this is something that they're going to have to get used to and adapt to. Now, in general, these players are not used to playing in front of a packed stadium, playing on TV that's being televised around the world. The DRS is in motion. The pressure of a World Cup final, the weight of your nation, in India's case, these external factors really, I think the women are still getting used to this. I think they're still not able to play their best cricket at this huge stage, at this huge global stage. There seems to be nerves that come into it. I remember the inaugural WBBL final between the Sydney Sixers and the Sydney Thunder, and in the game, both teams were only able to score 100 in the 20 overs, slightly above 100. And it was a crawl in both innings, and there was a catalogue of errors. I think it was the nerves of playing on such a stage. We saw in this game the catalogue of errors. We saw in the chase, wow. I mean, we saw Heather Knight drop a catch when India were 3 down, and you thought that was it for England. But then India, the way they threw it away, was quite bizarre. We saw Mithali Raj's run out, which was so needless at that time, a really bizarre run out. We saw Veda Krishnamurthy trying to hit every ball out of the ground. She perished. And then the rest of the batting just crumbling. There was the run out of Shikha Pandey, just an absolute panic attack from the whole batting lineup. And also, remember when the game seemingly was wrapped up for England, Jenny Gunn dropping that absolute sitter, although they did finish the game off in the next ball. Clearly, the nerves got the better of the players, and that's something they're going to have to get used to playing on this big stage. But it's only going to get better as there's more funding, more attention, and this becomes more of the norm with these 2020 leagues coming in, hopefully, to the women's game. This shouldn't be a problem in 10 years' time. But at the moment, in the infancy of the women's game being televised and being really captivating the attention of the worldwide cricketing audience, it is a problem at the moment. And tying into what we saw from this game, two problems I feel that still need to be ironed out. Runouts in general happen way too often for mine. If you look at the Men's World Cup, and I know I said not to compare, but this is just a yardstick because runouts are runouts. It's not like the men, they bowl faster than the women. A runout is a runout at the end of the day. So in the men's 2015 World Cup, 49 games, 39 runouts. In this Women's World Cup, we saw 31 games, 37 runouts. So the rate of runouts was a lot more. And if you watch the games, the runouts really are, it's almost like a panic, and a lot of them are not even close. Like there's no need for the third umpire in a lot of cases. There's really suicidal runs. And this really ties in to my next point is that there's too many dot balls played out, especially by the smaller teams. I think the West Indies really struggle with it. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, particularly, the smaller teams in general struggle to rotate the strike. It's really almost the mentality is I can't hit a boundary off this ball, so I'm just going to block it. There's no intent to score, and I almost feel like these teams, when you see this sort of accumulation of pressure, a lot of dot balls, there hasn't been a boundary in a while, and you see they sort of almost just stop thinking, and you'll see the ball hit straight to a fielder, and they'll just run. You only have to look at Shikha Pandey's run out in the final. There was a little bit of pressure building, and she just hit the ball straight to point, and she just set off for a suicidal run. That is something that has to improve. So really, the dot balls go hand in hand with the run outs, I feel. And in general, I think it's more of a mentality with the women. It's not like they're incapable of hitting singles. I just don't think that culture of just looking other like places other than boundaries for the smaller teams in general, it's just not there, I feel. So hopefully with more cricket, they can get more experience and really understand that that's where they need to go to bridge the gap to the elite teams in the world. Now, this goes into my third point. The third thing we learned is that the gap is closing in the women's game. Now, if you have a look at the women's game, basically it has been dominated by three countries: Australia, England, and New Zealand. No team other than these three nations has won a Women's World Cup. And in fact, the West Indies in 2016 winning the Women's World T20 was the first team outside these three nations to win a global women's event. So this just shows the dominance of Australia, England, and New Zealand in the women's game. But there is hope. And for the women's game to grow, there needs to be more parity. There needs to be more teams that are competitive. So this is good to see. What we've seen in this World Cup, I think, provided a little bit of hope for that. Now, look at South Africa. They made the semi-final and they were so close to making the final. This was their first semi-final since 2000, and they also made the semi-final of the 2014 Women's World T20. This could have been their first ever finals appearance if things had gone a different way. You look at India, they've made two of the last four finals of the Women's World Cup. They're coming along leaps and bounds. And then the West Indies, they made the final of the 2013 edition and they won the World T20 in 2016. They had a disappointing tournament this time around, no doubt, but they've come a long way as well. So India, South Africa, and West Indies are definitely bridging the gap and providing a more competitive environment for the women's game, which is crucial to its development. Again, the advent of these 2020 leagues certainly helping, and it's just a much needed thing for there to be more attention and more people willing to watch the women's game. It needs to be more competitive. And it's great to see these teams coming along. I think if you look at those three nations, definitely the domestic structures have really helped. You have to look at the best three teams in the history of women's cricket: Australia, New Zealand, and England. Look at their domestic structures, look at their infrastructure in general. They've got centrally contracted players on pretty decent wages. And in general, you look at their domestic systems, you look at Australia, they've got the WBBL, and you look at England, they've got the Kia Super League. So they've got these franchise 2020 tournaments, which is really good for their cricket. And they also have a strong domestic structure for their 50 over competition. New Zealand, they also have a good domestic structure. And these countries pump money into their women's game. They are able to provide the facilities and the also the fitness plans, the nutritional plans, all the things that go into performing at an elite level. They pump the money into, and we're seeing now countries like India, West Indies, South Africa following suit. We've seen recently that South Africa have made the game more professional. You've got centrally contracted players, and now that is helping them immensely. It makes sense when you have these contracts, that financial stability, players are able to put more time into improving their game. It's simple, really. And you have to look at India as well. Now, they've also got more money behind them. And after this performance at the getting to the final, almost winning the competition, they really should have won. You look at it now, all the eyeballs that were on it, it really captivated the imagination of the Indian public, it seemed, because apparently 100 million worldwide tuned in to watch the game. And I'm sure a vast portion of that was from the Indian population. So, really, I'm sure after this, you'll see a lot more money pumped into the women's game in India. And that is only going to help them improve. The West Indies as well also have a domestic structure going where each of the islands they play, and you have that 50 and 20 over competition, and that's also helped the West Indies to improve. All these countries as well have had players play in the Kia Super League and the WBBL. West Indies, you've got Deandra Dotton, Stefani Taylor, Hayley Matthews. India, Smriti Mandana, Harmanpreet Kaur. You look at South Africa, Dane van Niekerk, Marizan Kapp, Shabi Ismail. The list goes on. And that experience of playing against the best players from the big countries like Australia, England, and New Zealand only helps. More competition, more games, more experience. It just helps bridge the gap. That is crucial for these teams to keep on that path. Now, again, this follows to my fourth point. The fourth thing we learned is that the gap still is quite large to certain teams. Now, you look at Sri Lanka and Pakistan, they were woefully left behind in this tournament. And they are two teams that the gap is still very wide between the elite teams and them. And when you think about the fact that they're the seventh and eighth best teams in the world, that's not ideal. You want to have more competitive teams. Now, for Sri Lanka and Pakistan, the big problem is they don't have as much backing of their home boards. They don't have as much money pumped in. They really have no domestic structure to speak of. Yes, they have central contracts, but they're not as much money as the other countries are able to provide. So, really, it's very difficult for those two to be able. They don't have the access to the facilities that these other countries do. Not to mention that they haven't had any players play in the WBBL or the Kia Super League, unlike the West Indies, South Africa, and India, to develop their skills further. So in that way, they've also been left behind. And I think we saw from Sri Lanka and Pakistan just sort of the type of cricket that we saw in the women's game maybe 10, 15 years ago, struggling to score very quickly and very toothless bowling, really. And in the field as well, both teams are quite ordinary. There's a lack of athleticism, and running between the wickets is very chaotic. It's almost like a throwback to where the women's game was 10, 15 years ago. These teams haven't really developed. And the biggest thing they need is more funding. As I've said, more funding. You get better facilities. You're able to train more. You get bigger contracts. You're able to put more time to that. You don't have to do that job on the side. You can have better fitness regimes, better nutritional plans, all the things that go in to improving yourself as a cricketer. And Sri Lanka and Pakistan, look at them in this tournament. They weren't able to get big scores. We saw that really neither team had the firepower to trouble the best teams. They simply weren't able to score the high 200s, low 300 scores. And the bowling, it's the sort of archaic formula of, okay, we don't really have a lot of wicket takers, so we'll just try and restrict you as much as we can with a very defensive ploy. And that just doesn't work in modern cricket with the array of shots that some of these girls have. It's just not going to work. And also, I think the big thing with these teams, the frustration I have, is the dot balls that they face. It's kind of ridiculous how many dot balls they take up, which leads to these kamikaze runs. It's this lack of willingness almost to hit singles. It's almost not part of the culture. And that's something that definitely has to improve because such a big part of scoring the scores like 280, 300, 320 is the singles, the twos, the running between the wickets, better fitness, a change in mindset, also improved skills to be able to maneuver the field. These are the things that need to happen for these countries. And not just these countries, look at the other developing nations like Bangladesh, Ireland, Zimbabwe. The same thing applies to them, all these same things, to be able to bridge the gap to the elite nations. Really, it's all about, it starts at the top with the funding, and that is definitely something that needs to happen if we are to see more teams become competitive in the women's game. The final thing that we learned from the ICC Women's World Cup 2017 is that people want to watch the women's game. If you provide them with a good product, if you market it appropriately, people will show up. At the final at Lords, it was basically a packed house. Now, I know that India being there had a big part to do in that. You can imagine after the semi-final result how many Indians bought a ticket. It was the dream final, really, for the organisers, the hosts, against the biggest cricketing nation in terms of fan base. So no doubt that helped, but we saw people wanted to come, and it was a great event. Now, one caveat to this, which was very disappointing, is that the members' pavilion was basically empty, only a scattering of people there. Now, this is sort of feeding into that old stereotype. The MCC, the members are really the most traditional, I guess, when you come to cricket. And I am assuming the way they think is women's cricket is not real cricket. That's what I'm assuming they feel. For there to be such a big snub from them, and you saw the rest of the ground was packed, I'm pretty certain that's what was going on, and that's not a good look. Really, they should be out there supporting women's cricket. It's an archaic mindset, and hopefully, those kind of people, we see less of them in the future. But let's look at the positives. How good were the knockouts in this tournament? We saw England, South Africa going to the last few balls, India upsetting Australia in incredible fashion in the other semi-final, and then this semi. Wow, what a tantalizing finish. You thought that India were in complete cruise control, but then England completely turned the game on its head and they end up winning by 10 runs. And it was a really, really enthralling finish. Great to see such good knockout games. And I think in general, you look at the tournament, you saw that there were 5 teams really very difficult to separate in the group stage. You saw in the last game, India versus New Zealand, a virtual quarter final to decide the last semi-final spot. Right throughout the group stage, it was neck and neck between those 5 teams. It was really competitive. As I said, yes, the bottom end certainly left a lot to be desired, but the top end of the tournament was great, and the knockout games were great. Now, this sort of ties into what's next for women's cricket. We saw that there was very healthy attendance in this tournament. People were interested in the game. You see, when you market it well, then people will come. And no doubt this has created a new fan base. Apparently, around half the people at the final were women, and that's great for young girls to see these players and for them to be their heroes and to aspire to play cricket. I think is great. I think it's important that young girls have these female role models to go on. It really provides a sense of almost hope. It brings that dream a bit closer, the fact that, hey, I could do this. If she couldn't, why can't I? And I think that's fantastic for the game. Now, how does the women's game go from here? Clearly, it's about putting more money in. Certainly, India getting into the final was probably the best thing that could happen to the tournament because we saw it capture the imagination of the Indian public. Now, surely India's going to pump money in. It's the biggest cricketing market. If India's interested in the women's game, then that is fantastic. There are rumors of a women's IPL coming into play. Now, that would be huge for the women's game. A women's IPL would bring in so much money, so much more attention, and really enhance the profile of the game further. You look at how much the players who have played in the Kia Super League and the WBBL have improved and how that has helped bridge the gap in the quality. I think that's only going to be better for women's cricket to make it more competitive, for these players to improve their skills. You're going to see the power hitting keep going from strength to strength, which creates a better product, and that can only be good for the women's game. So I definitely think these franchise 2020 tournaments will see more of them in the women's game. Hopefully, we see them play more at the biggest stadiums. I still think that mostly they should be played at boutique venues so that you can create a more capacity crowd, create a better atmosphere. But I feel like, particularly in these domestic 2020 tournaments, you can start to put them at the bigger grounds, particularly the semis and the finals. And also, I look at the example of the WBBL where they have double headers. They have the women's before the men's game. That's a great thing to help boost the crowds. Stuff like that to increase the crowds. Obviously, there needs to be more games on TV. Hopefully, we see more and more games televised, the DRS be used more and more to just increase the profile and increase the legitimacy of the game. If it's on TV, people will watch. And I think if the organizers give the game this credibility by putting it in big stadiums, by putting it on TV, by using DRS, then the public will follow suit. They'll think if they take it seriously, then I can take it seriously as well. So all those things can certainly help the women's game. Realistically, they have to focus on the shorter formats at the moment, getting more franchise 2020 leagues, and also continuing to grow the 50 over game. I think the women's cricket league for the ODI format is great. You have the top 8 teams, and that goes to World Cup qualification. Top 4 from that go straight to the World Cup. Bottom 4 go to the qualifier. I think that's a really good format. They should keep persisting with that. Test matches at the moment, I don't think should be high priority for the women's game. At the moment, you only see just the one women's Ashes test at the moment. That's really all the test cricket's played. I think that's really how it should continue for the foreseeable future. Really, you need to focus on growing the game, and that is certainly going to be best done through the shorter formats. So that concludes the podcast. That was my 5 things that we learned from the ICC Women's World Cup 2017. Number 1, the game is evolving. Number 2, there are still some things to work on. Number 3, the gap is closing to the top teams. Number 4, at the same time, there are some teams that are still lagging behind. And number 5, people are willing to watch the women's game, and it's important that they continue to grow the game in the right manner. So yes, that is the podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed it. You can check out the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. All those links are on the Twitter page. Now, I think the next podcast will be a topical podcast, just an issue from the world of cricket, because you've got the test matches between Sri Lanka and India and England and South Africa going on, and I don't like to look at those tests until they're done. So yes, expect that for the next podcast before I then review those 2 test matches. But that is it from me today. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you later.